The morning began with the quiet, predictable rhythm that Adrian Leighton had come to cherish. In his home office in Plano, Texas, the world outside was just waking up, and the soft golden light of dawn spilled across his polished desk. It was a sanctuary of order and control, a stark contrast to the chaotic legal battles he often waded through professionally. As a real estate attorney, his mornings were typically dedicated to scanning the market, a quick, professional habit to gauge the pulse of the city's property landscape. He clicked onto the major real estate portal, expecting to see the usual array of listings, a sea of anonymous homes and hopeful sellers. The first sip of his coffee was still warm on his tongue when his entire world tilted on its axis. There, nestled among the other properties, was his own house. For a fleeting second, his brain refused to process the information, dismissing it as a trick of the eye or a bizarre glitch in the website's algorithm. But the image was unmistakable. The distinct brick facade, the custom-made oak door, the perfectly manicured lawn he himself had mowed just 2 days prior. The headline read, with an unnerving cheerfulness, "For sale by owner." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, began to replace the warmth of his coffee. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from panic yet, but from a profound and unsettling confusion. This was impossible. He had never, not even in passing, considered selling this home. His eyes, now wide with a dawning horror, scanned the listing details. The description was generic yet insidious, mentioning a motivated seller and urging a quick sale. But it was the photographs that turned his confusion into cold, simmering anger. These weren't old stock photos or pictures from when he had bought the place. They were recent, terrifyingly so. They showed his living room with the new rug Maya had picked out, his kitchen with the specific coffee maker that sat on the counter right now. Every detail was correct, intimate, and invasive. It felt like a violation, a burglary that had taken place not of objects, but of his very privacy. Someone had been watching, someone had been documenting his home, his life, and then he saw it. One of the exterior shots, meant to showcase the spacious driveway, prominently featured his son's basketball hoop, the very same hoop that had been the subject of the latest nitpicking citation from the HOA, a notice he had crumpled up in frustration just last week. In that single chilling moment, all the scattered pieces of petty harassment, the letters about the grass being a half-inch too long, the warnings about the unauthorized welcome mat, the constant, nagging presence of Colleen Ashford's authority, snapped into a terrifyingly clear picture. This was not a random act of digital vandalism or a clerical error. This was deliberate. This was targeted. This was the culmination of a silent war he hadn't even known he was fighting, an escalation from petty fines to a full-scale assault on his most fundamental right, the right to his own home. The mug felt heavy in his hand, the coffee now forgotten and cold, as the comfortable reality of his morning shattered completely, replaced by the certain knowledge that he was under attack. The initial, cold shock of the fraudulent listing began to thaw, replaced by a hot, focused anger that had been years in the making. Adrian stood from his desk, the image of his own home burning on the screen behind him, and walked not to his phone, but to the far wall of his study. There, pinned to a large corkboard that was supposed to be for future case notes and family reminders, was a different kind of archive altogether. It was a tapestry of pettiness, a chronological map of a silent war waged with paper and ink. This was Colleen Ashford's legacy. He reached out and touched the first notice, a flimsy sheet of paper that now felt like the opening shot in a long campaign. It was from over 2 years ago, citing him for a sustained visual blight, a patch of grass near the curb that measured a half-inch longer than the HOA covenant's stipulated maximum. He remembered the absurdity of it, standing in the blazing Texas sun with a ruler, confirming the violation himself, a mix of amusement and irritation bubbling in his chest. He had paid the fine, a trivial amount, chalking it up to the minor tax of suburban life. But the notices kept coming, each one a little more intrusive, a little more personal. The unauthorized aesthetic deviation was for a vibrant, floral welcome Matt Maya's mother had gifted them, deemed not in keeping with the community's neutral earth tone palette. Then came the warning about the potential safety hazard and visual clutter of his son's bicycle, left on the porch for a mere hour while the boy ran inside for a drink. Each envelope in the mailbox bearing the official HOA insignia was no longer just an invoice. It was a message. It was a reminder that he was being watched, that his private domain was considered public domain by a woman whose authority ended at the edge of her own property line. The fines were never about the money. They were about the principle, a relentless testing of his boundaries. He had tried reason, attending a meeting to calmly explain that a child's bicycle was not a municipal hazard, only to be met with Colleen's steely, bureaucratic gaze and a recitation of Bylaw 14C. He had tried compliance, swapping the cheerful welcome mat for a drab, beige one, feeling a small piece of his home's personality being erased. The basketball hoop had been the latest and most bitter battle. His son lived for those afternoon games in the driveway, the rhythmic thump of the ball a soundtrack to their family evenings. The citation had called it an unapproved permanent structure and neighborhood eyesore. Adrian had fired off a terse email, pointing out its portable, wheeled base and its clear status as a temporary recreational item. The response from Colleen had been a masterpiece of passive-aggressive legalism, citing a clause about structures, permanent or otherwise, that alter the uniform streetscape. He had refused to remove it, and the fines had begun to accrue, a monthly toll for his defiance. Now, standing before the pinboard, he saw the entire narrative laid out before him. The grass, the mat, the bicycle, they were all skirmishes. The basketball hoop was a pitched battle. And the fraudulent listing? That was the nuclear option. This was no longer harassment. It was an attempt at forced exile. She hadn't just been trying to fine him into submission. She had been trying to fine him out of his home. And when that hadn't worked fast enough, she had decided to simply sell it out from under him. The paper trail was no longer just a collection of petty grievances. It was the premeditated history of a deeply personal vendetta, and the listing was its logical, terrifying conclusion. The fracture in the neighborhood did not announce itself with shouting or public arguments. It was a subtle, creeping chill that settled over Pecan Grove, a quiet tension that everyone felt but no one dared to name aloud. The news of the fraudulent listing did not so much break as it seeped out, moving through the subdivision not like a wildfire but like a slow-moving fog, condensing on windows and settling in the spaces between neighbors who had once exchanged nothing more than friendly waves. Adrian felt it the moment he stepped outside to get his mail the next evening. The air itself felt different, charged with a silent, watching energy. The familiar rhythm of sprinklers and distant lawnmowers seemed muted, as if the very street was holding its breath. He saw Mrs. Garcia, her kind, wrinkled face etched with concern, carefully watering her prize-winning roses. She offered him a small, sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a look that said more than words ever could. "We saw it, Adrian," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "We knew it wasn't true, some of us. We've had our own troubles." It was a quiet admission of solidarity, a confirmation that he wasn't imagining the pattern of control. But as he thanked her, his gaze drifted across the street. There was Mark, a man whose kids sometimes played with his son, walking his golden retriever. For years, their interaction had been a simple, raised hand in greeting. Today, as Mark's eyes met Adrian's, there was a flicker of something else. Unease, fear, complicity, before he quickly looked away, pretending to be intensely interested in a tree, and deliberately crossed to the other side of the road. The snub was a physical blow. It wasn't just indifference. It was an active disengagement, a choice to side with the prevailing power rather than the neighbor in the right. This was the new reality of Pecan Grove. You were either with Colleen or you were against her, and being against her was a risk few were willing to take. The neighborhood had been quietly sorted into two camps, those who saw Adrian's fight as their own long-awaited chance for justice, and those who saw him as a troublesome disruptor, a rock thrown into the still pond of their controlled existence. Whispers began to circulate, carried on the breeze during evening walks and over backyard fences. Some said Adrian was exaggerating, that he must have done something to provoke such an extreme response. Others, emboldened by his defiance, started sharing their own stories in hushed tones of being fined for a garbage can lid left ajar, for a Halloween decoration deemed too gaudy, for parking a guest's car slightly over the sidewalk line for a single hour. The community chat group, once a forum for lost pets and recommendations for plumbers, fell into an uneasy silence, nobody wanting to commit their opinion to text. The subdivision had become a stage for a silent play of allegiances. A supportive nod from one person at the grocery store felt like a major victory. A cold shoulder from another was a reminder of the invisible battle lines that had been drawn. The fight was no longer just between Adrian and Colleen. It had been outsourced to every driveway and front lawn. The pressure was immense, a constant low-grade hum of judgment. But in that pressure, Adrian also found a grim resolve. He realized he was no longer fighting just for his own home, but for the soul of the neighborhood itself. He was the litmus test, the one who had decided to stop whispering and start speaking. And the entire street was watching, waiting to see if one man could actually stand up to the shadow that had loomed over them for so long. The air in the community hall was thick and heavy, saturated with a tension that had been simmering for weeks. It was the night of the monthly HOA meeting, a ritual that had long been a dull exercise in bureaucratic formalities, but tonight it felt more like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Every plastic chair was occupied, the low murmur of conversation a nervous hum beneath the fluorescent lights. Adrian stood for a moment at the back, observing the scene. He saw the usual faces, but their expressions were different, guarded, expectant, some flickering with a spark of hope they dared not fully acknowledge. At the head of the room, seated behind a long table like a judge on the bench, was Colleen Ashford. She presided with her customary air of untouchable authority, her posture rigid, her smile a thin, bloodless line as she called the meeting to order. She moved through the agenda with brisk efficiency, discussing budget allocations for sidewalk repairs and the upcoming community garage sale, her voice a study in controlled normalcy. It was a performance, a desperate attempt to pretend the world she controlled was still spinning on its axis as she had designed it. When she opened the floor for new business, her eyes scanned the room, carefully avoiding the space where Adrian stood. Her pause was a fraction too long, a silent plea for the evening to end without incident. That was when he moved. The squeak of his shoes on the linoleum floor was deafening in the sudden quiet. All heads turned as he walked, not to the public microphone, but directly toward the front of the room, his stride calm and deliberate, a legal pad clutched in one hand. The silence became absolute, broken only by the rustle of his clothing. He reached the projector without a word, plugging in a small USB drive. Colleen's composure began to crack. "Adrian, there's a proper procedure for—" she began, her voice sharp, but he ignored her. With a click, the familiar damning image of his own home, listed for sale, glowed on the large screen behind her. A collective sharp intake of breath filled the room. "I have some new business, Colleen," he said, his voice not loud but clear and cutting, carrying to every corner of the hall. He turned to face the audience, his gaze sweeping over his neighbors. "I'd like to discuss this fraudulent listing of my property. The one you posted, Colleen." The accusation hung in the air, solid and undeniable. Her face, once a mask of impenetrable calm, flushed a deep mottled red. "That is an outrageous accusation," she blustered, half rising from her chair, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. "You can't prove a thing! This is slander!" But Adrian didn't raise his voice. He remained preternaturally calm, a rock in the storm of her panic. "I'm Adrian Leighton," he said, pausing to let the weight of his name, his profession, settle in the room. "And while you've been busy writing me citations for my grass and my son's basketball hoop, you seem to have forgotten one minor detail." He let the silence build, a perfect theatrical beat that held the entire room captive. "I am a real estate attorney." The revelation landed not with a shout, but with the quiet final force of a gavel, and as the gasps and murmurs erupted around him, he reached into his legal pad, produced a single, crisp legal envelope, and placed it on the table directly in front of her. "And as of this moment," he said, his eyes locked on hers, "you are personally served." The room exploded into a chaos of voices, but the battle in that precise instant was already over. He had not just exposed her crime, he had dismantled her authority in front of the very people she had sought to control, turning her own stage into her courtroom. The resolution, when it finally came, was not marked by a dramatic courtroom showdown or a public apology, but by the quiet, decisive language of legal documents and the profound silence of a battle concluded. In the weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting, the process unfolded with a methodical, almost anticlimactic precision. There were no more shouting matches, no more anonymous letters, only the sobering exchange of paperwork between attorneys. Sitting in the polished calm of his professional law office, a world away from the emotional battleground of his neighborhood, Adrian reviewed the final settlement agreement. Maya sat across from him, the question in her eyes before she even gave it voice. "So it's done?" she asked, her tone a mixture of hope and weary exhaustion. He nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of the entire ordeal. Colleen Ashford had resigned from the HOA board effective immediately, a stipulation she had fought against until the very end, her pride being the last fortress to fall. The fraudulent listing was not merely taken down, it was formally expunged from the property records, its digital ghost erased to ensure no future cloud on their home's title. There was a substantial, undisclosed financial settlement for damages, not just for the legal violation, but for the profound emotional distress, a number that finally, in the cold language of commerce, quantified the cost of their violated peace. But for Adrian, the most critical clause was the permanent injunction. It was a legal sword that would hang over Colleen Ashford for the rest of her life, a court order barring her from ever holding a position of power in any homeowners association again. It was a specific, targeted form of justice, designed not to destroy her, but to disarm her, to permanently neuter the instrument of control she had so relished. As he looked out the window of his office, watching the normal, uncomplicated flow of traffic below, he felt the last of the tension leave his shoulders. The weight was gone. Maya put it into words, articulating the core delusion that had fueled the entire conflict. She thought she was untouchable, she said, a trace of lingering disbelief in her voice. Just a petty tyrant in a suburb playing queen of a kingdom no one else wanted to rule. Adrian turned back from the window, a small, weary, but deeply satisfied smile touching his lips. It was the smile of a man who had not just won, but who understood precisely why he had won. "They always do," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "They pick on the wrong people, counting on them to be too tired, too scared, or too financially strained to fight back. They operate on the assumption that their victims lack the resources, the knowledge, or the sheer stubborn will to stand their ground." He paused, letting the lesson of the entire experience crystallize. They weaponize bureaucracy, thinking that a thicket of rules and the threat of fines will be enough to crush a person's spirit. But they never expect the fight to come from someone who knows the rulebook better than they do. This was the true conclusion. It was more than a personal victory. It was a testament to the power of rightful resistance. The story ended not with vengeance, but with restoration. The restoration of his family's peace. The restoration of justice and the restoration of a simple, powerful truth that no one, not even a self-appointed queen of a suburban fiefdom, is above the law.